Hello and welcome to CANNAMAntv. My name is Connor McLeod, and in this interview I speak with Philip H Farber, author of High Magick, A Guide to Cannabis and Ritual and Mysticism. In this interview we discuss Phil's book, High Magick, A Guide to Cannabis and Ritual and Mysticism, what magic is and popular misconceptions around magic, Alistair Crowley, consciousness and cannabis, Neurolinguistic Programming, and Archetypes and the nature of synchronicity. Make sure and like and subscribe, and join me on Patreon, where you could help to build a stronger cannabis media platform for £3 a month. Now then, let's talk cannabis. Thank you so much for joining me here, Phil. This is going to be super fun. The first thing I was going to ask is, what was it that drew you into magic? I mean, a lot of people that will be watching this will be skeptical. I'm sure you've come across numerous people. We're in a scientifically orientated culture. So what drew you to magic, essentially?
Let me just start by saying that I'm a science-oriented person. I grew up, both of my parents were working scientists. My father was a physicist, my mom was a biologist. So my early training, my sensibilities, the way I think is really grounded in science. That's the way I learned to think about things.
Yeah.
And magic, well, let's see. When I was a kid, there were, I don't know, a number of influences that all came together. When I was a kid, I was always very interested in, the paranormal, ESP, things like that. And at that time, in the 1960s, there was some legitimate research. That was actually a legitimate field of scientific inquiry. Somehow it's sort of fallen out of favor in more recent years.
Yeah.
So I was always very interested in that. I learned how to meditate when I was 10, 11 years old. And my father, who again was a physicist, worked his way through college as a stage magician. And he had a bunch of books. Part of his routine was a stage hypnosis act. And he had a bunch of books on hypnosis. They were old, crazy books from like the 1940s and 50s and things like that. And I dived into those at a very early age, and it partially sparked some of my interest in altered states to begin with, and about the things that can happen in altered states. When I was 16, I was in a bicycle accident, and I had a severe head injury, traumatic brain injury, and a full near-death experience. I saw the light, there was an entity, all that crazy stuff. And I came out of that with the sense that, well, there's something a lot more in our consciousness. The world is not always what it seems, right?
Yeah.
There's things beyond our usual awareness. And along with my previous interest in meditation and hypnosis and altered states, that really sparked a much more direct, how do you get back to that kind of experience?
Yeah.
And through a series of coincidences, people accidentally leaving Alistair Crowley books in my apartment when I was in college, and Robert Anton Wilson books and things like that. And I started diving into it. And both of those guys who I mentioned, Alistair Crowley and Robert Anton Wilson, had a very scientific background. In fact, Robert Anton Wilson studied physics along with my father. They were co-students at Brooklyn Polytechnic. So anyway, and Crowley, who is probably the most infamous of modern magicians, he has a very bad rep, partially undeserved. He trained at Cambridge as a chemist. So there's this very scientific background to the way they approached it. And that really appealed to me, that you could do things in the realm of, psyche and mental and subjective experiences and things like that, and have ways to evaluate it and to find out what's replicable and what's not. So that's sort of the way I went into magic was, this is something we could test, right? Can we learn what really works? And so that's kind of how I got into it. I did start, I dived into books and started practicing. And back then it was very difficult to find other people who were into magic.
Yeah.
I had to drive 100 miles to New York City, and then to find even a bookstore that had magic books at the time. And nowadays it's it's simple. You go on Facebook and you say magic groups or whatever, and there's a million of them.
So I mean, for people that so for people that are like completely unaware of what magic is, that, essentially the way I think about it is it's kind of like a tool. It's just a utility, essentially. Depending on the intention of the person, that's the depth in which I've accumulated so far. But how would you define what magic is?
Well, in my books, I tend to leave it open. I present several different definitions and let people choose for themselves. The way that a lot of people think about magic comes from movies and books and fantasy, right? Yeah. And where you mumble something in Latin and poof, it appears. You wave your wand, right? And you got to remember that's fiction, right? I mean, everybody else who's in movies and things like that, they're not real, right? Movie cops are not like real cops. Movie lawyers are not like real lawyers. Movie magicians are definitely not like real magicians. Okay. Anyway, there is, at this point, there's maybe a little bit of, I'm going to give you the broadest definition, which was Alistair Crowley's, which was magic is the art and science of causing change in conformity with will. Now that's pretty broad, right? If I crack an egg and throw it in the skillet, my intention is to change that egg into an omelet, and that's a work of magic, according to Crowley, right? But most people tend to think of it as more the paranormal end of it, right? I'm causing change in conformity with will, and magically the bag of money appears on my desk, or my influence in the world becomes different or grows or whatever it is. Now, I'm not. I include all of that. I do think that there are a lot of very interesting paranormal and unexplored phenomena that happen to just about everybody. That most of the time we just discount it. And there's people who are really studying some of this. Rupert Sheldrake, for instance, has been doing studies on people who know who's at the other end of the phone when it rings, right? It's one of those common experiences that we all have. Yeah. And yet it hasn't really been studied, right? So in terms of magic, there's that sort of mundane end of it where yes, I'm making an omelet, right? That's a work of magic. But on the other hand, there's sometimes other definitely less causally related things that happen. Synchronicities and results out of the blue and things like that. So anyway, one of my definitions, working definitions, is that magic is a form of ritual technology. It's a form of using ritual and other psychological, mental tools to cause change in conformity with will. Yeah. And most of the things that people see, in magic books and things like that are ritual based. And just in recent years, we've actually had some scientific studies that show that ritual is really it's a natural thing that humans do, and it's a very important part of the way we frame our experiences and the way that we kind of judge them and interpret them. Whether or not, for instance, there was one experiment a few years back where they had people do a simple ritual before eating, and they gave them the most boring kinds of food, raw carrot sticks and things like that. And people who performed a small ritual, it didn't really matter the content of the ritual. One of the rituals was, I think, tapping the carrot stick on the table 3 times before you ate it. People who engaged in the ritual enjoyed the carrot sticks more than the people who didn't, and by a big margin. And so it's just showing that the framing, the way that we engage in something, and the factors that we set up before and after and so on, definitely change our interpretation or our subjective experience of whatever that is.
So
Okay.
High Magick, in the context of that then, I mean, obviously your book, High Magick and Cannabis and Ritual, I mean, what is High Magick specifically?
In traditional magic, you have high magic and low magic, or practical magic. High magic is about improving yourself, finding your connection to deity or to the universe or infinity, or however you want to frame that.
Yeah.
And low magic or practical magic was like getting things done,
Mm.
you know, making money, improving your relationships, things like that.
Right.
So the play on high magic, of course,
Yeah,
is,
yeah.
you know,
I didn't even, it just didn't even
we
cross
also
my
like
mind.
to get high, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Right. I had titled one of the chapters High Magic, where I was actually talking about high magic, but the publisher just loved that. They got caught up in the pun. They're like, oh, we have to title the book this. So
Yeah,
it's like,
nice.
all right.
Nice.
And you know, the point of the book is that not necessarily that cannabis is absolutely necessary for magic, because it isn't. There's nothing that's absolutely necessary for magic except human consciousness. However, there is a really long history and association of the use of cannabis by magicians and alchemists and yogis and meditators of all kinds, going back to prehistory. And I know you talked about some of that with Angus.
Yeah, that's right.
In
Yeah,
that
yeah,
interview, going back to the Naths and those folks, but it goes back even further. Albert Hoffman, who is the great pharmacologist who first discovered LSD, and wrote many books on ethnobotany and so on. He proposed the idea that the origins of yoga and magic were actually attempts to recreate the cannabis experience. That people were learning how to meditate because they wanted to get back in that state, and maybe they couldn't find that plant again or whatever it was.
Yeah.
So it definitely goes back to prehistory. We have archaeological things going back to the corded ware culture. I mean, going back to the very dawn of history itself.
Yeah.
As far as we have records that people were using cannabis, most likely in a ritual manner.
Yeah, it's interesting that, I mean, I'll be honest, Phil, the reason why I contacted you, because I have a real interest in this topic, obviously with cannabis, it was just perfect. But the thing that introduced me really to magic, out with being a child essentially, or Harry Potter, stuff like that, was alchemy. So like my interest in alchemy, and it's just my interest in all of this stuff, really, alchemy, magic, the nature of transformation, as a consequence of doing the channel and producing the content. And it's interesting because when I look back on the timeline of obviously what I've been doing producing this stuff, there seems to be, you described it as synchronicities, you know, Carl Jung's term, that there seems to be synchronicities, and that's what I liked about the book The Alchemist as well, Paulo Coelho, is that this is not an uncommon situation. And what's interesting about this is, and that's what I mean about when you mentioned about the consciousness, the importance in magic around consciousness, there seems to be a lot of this thing, if somebody engages in a meaningful pursuit, it seems to be largely intuitive. And I think that's what I find it quite interesting when looking into like some of the stuff you'd written, and obviously alchemy as well. There seems to be just this, and you obviously, I spoke about it in an interview with Angus, the relationship between consciousness and I think that's what the whole point of me trying to get at was, like the bridge between consciousness and the physical reality. That thing, there's got to be a unified, there's got to be an accessible void of some degree that bridges consciousness with the physical realm, and that's what it's like. Alchemy seems to be as close as you get, almost, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean the alchemists and the magicians, particularly when you get into European history, you know, the Middle Ages and so on, it's very closely entwined. I mean, the alchemists were the magicians and so on. Previous to that, you have alchemists in, I mean, different parts of the world. Angus was talking about in India and the tantric alchemists, but you also had Taoist alchemists in China, going way back. In fact, the very first written mention of cannabis was the Emperor Shennong's Pharmacopoeia in 2737 or something like that BC. and basically he wrote that among a list of medical things that he, it's good for your stomach, it's good for this, but he also wrote that it helps the user to become closer to the Tao.
Right.
So going way back to that, and the Taoist alchemy is one of the more complex and kind of deeper ends of alchemy and magic. I don't claim to understand more than a little glimpse of that, but
well, it was bits just to go back to the thing I'd mentioned about synchronicities. It was actually, I have the I Ching, whatever you pronounce it, I Ching. Scottishness destroying that term in there, but let's move forward. So the I Ching, and it's that I had it for a few years, and it was just kind of sitting in the house. I didn't buy it, and it just seemed to be in my periphery, and then it just happenstance eventually picked it up, and it's just a bizarre. It sounds silly and probably rambling, but there just seems to be, when I look back on what's been going on, I don't know. What is your personal belief? I'll be honest, Phil, there feels like there's a guiding element going on. And I think the more and more I create this stuff, and that even before, like I went through a period of, I would say, close to mania about 6 or 7 years ago. And it was in correlation with this process I'm doing with the channel and creating these cartoons and illustrations. And as a consequence of going through that transitional stage, it seemed really intense. At the same time as that, obviously, I'm inquiring into what's going on in the world. What is like science is obviously isn't the be all end all. Why is religion here if it doesn't make sense? And then you get to that point where there's that connection element. So what do you personally believe is going on? Like when these things, when the individual puts their consciousness into a place where it becomes receptive, like what do you think happens? What's going on?
Well, let's see. One magician who I was friends with some years back, his definition of magic was creating a positive relationship with synchronicity. Right. So you would use the ritual techniques and so on to create more probability of things happening in line with that. Mm-hmm. The idea of synchronicity would go back to Carl Jung, who suggested that there were these experiences that we all had of acausal relationships between things. That his example was that let's say you went out. Well, let's see. You went out and bought some new black clothes, and then suddenly the next day you learned that your friend died and you had to go to a funeral. Yeah. Right. That would be a good example of synchronicity. Mm-hmm. And similarly, we have in magic, synchronicity is almost the intent of some of the rituals, right? You want to increase the probability of various things happening, and by framing it in certain ways, and the theory is getting it into your unconscious mind, which Jung told us had a connection to the collective unconscious, to everything, the universe, and so on. That we can actually, by sort of, in a sense, front loading your consciousness with certain ideas, then the probability of synchronicity happening along those lines becomes increased. Mm. Everybody who gets into magic has some crazy long string of synchronicities that got them there. In my case, it was people leaving books in my apartment, and then running into people who had similar ideas just out of the blue and things like that. And then as you get into the practices, the rituals themselves, I mean, some of the synchronicities that happen are just, crazy and otherwise unexplainable. Yeah. So my personal belief on that is that, again, there's levels of reality that we are ill-equipped to perceive in general, that the human senses are very, very limited. Your eyesight is only within a certain narrow range of the electromagnetic frequency. Our sense of smell is limited compared to, say, dogs or cats or something. Same with our hearing. It's a very limited range of auditory frequencies and so on. And then there's things that we can't even comprehend. I mean, there's levels of reality that, I mean, you need a hadron collider to understand, right? To actually measure, or an electron microscope or things like that, right? We use tools to expand our senses, and we're still not getting anywhere near a complete picture of the reality that we're in at the moment. How do synchronicities happen in that? There's a lot of theories. I'm not sure I've fully bought into any one or of the theories, but as to paraphrase Alistair Crowley, when you take certain actions, certain events follow. Yeah. Right. So when you start to practice the rituals, and you notice that when I do this ritual, well, yeah, these events start to happen. These synchronicities sort of fall in line with that. Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned you mentioned earlier that obviously, I mean, Alistair Crowley, he's had obviously an extremely bad rap. Did he not used to refer to himself as the Beast? Was that guy?
Well, that was a nickname that his mother gave him.
Right.
Actually, when he was a terrible little kid, his parents were fundamentalist Christians, and anything that was bad, of course, was the Beast. But he liked the nickname, and he kept it. Yeah. Mainly, he's sort of infamous because at the time he was talking about things like, hey, using drugs or sexual freedom or things like that, and at the time that was highly controversial. Much less controversial these days, but back then that was crazy stuff. And so he was branded a black magician because of the sex and drugs aspect mostly of what he was doing.
I think sorry, I was going to say, one of the things that I found quite interesting about like the coming across the magic stuff in alchemy was that one of the things was about if you increase your success in the hierarchy of magical practice, I think, is it something like the full attainment is to potentially reside in the consciousnness and in the memories of others, and that's when you get to that point. And I think that's where like he has notoriety is supposed to be, like, because he tried to, was it like invoke? Did he not try and invoke something and over the course of 18 months, and then that's why people remember him? And this is all the unified, obviously, story of his legend, his infamy.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of he did a lot in his life, and in fact, he did so much more than the average person that it's sort of mind-boggling. He did these just incredible feats of magic where he would practice every day for hours and hours. I mean, things that most people do not have the discipline to even get near. Yeah. Plus, he was a record-setting mountain climber. He climbed the mountains in the Himalayas. He was a chess master. He was a spy for the British government. I mean, he had a jam-packed life. He rode a horse across China. He did, I mean, just insane things. So yeah, he did. Which of those rituals he did that the legend formed around, I don't know, because he did so many. And there's one, I mean, there's crazy stories. Trying to remember the guy's name, Simmons. There was, shortly after his death, there was a few kind of tell-all expose books that were there to get people's, I don't know, like clickbait is today. Right. And one story of how he invoked the god, or he evoked the god Pan, and then went crazy and had to be committed to an asylum. Absolutely no truth at all in that story. He was not committed to an asylum. He did not evoke the god Pan, et cetera, et cetera. But that's one that people latch onto and they go, oh yeah, see, his form of magic. All right, the core phrase that his magic worked around was, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." Yeah. And in his consciousness, in his mind, the word "thou." Remember that he grew up in a fundamentalist Christian family. When you use the term "thou," it's not necessarily referring to your individual consciousness. It's referring to the deity. It's referring to God. So when he says, "Do what thou wilt," it's more like doing your will in God's work or whatever it is, right? So there's still that, a higher principle involved there that most people take that as do what thou wilt is licensed to do whatever you want.
Yeah.
But not really. In Crowley's system, finding out what your will is in line with the universe and deity and so on was actually a very difficult task. It's what the magician set his life to finding out and doing. So definitely a lot more to that. Just as a point of cannabis interest, the phrase "do what thou wilt" first appeared in the writings of Francois Rabelais in the 1500s. Are you familiar with Rabelais?
No, I'm not.
Oh, okay. Sometimes called the drunk monk. He wrote some of the greatest early satires, one of them being the book Pantagruelian, and which featured the character, I'm sorry, Pantagruel was the title. And the character Pantagruel, at one point in the story, he's outfitting a ship to go traveling in, and he says the most important thing that we must take on the ship is the herb Pantagruelian, and he lists as an entire chapter listing the uses of the herb Pantagruelian, and it's obviously cannabis. And, you know, it's rope, it's the sails, it's the medicine, it's the things that keeps us happy. I mean, just this whole a full chapter of you know, one of the early lists of the many features of cannabis. So there's that phrase "do what thou wilt" was the motto of Pantagruel's place called the Abbey of Thelema, where the only rule was "do what thou wilt." And and what they wilt at the time was smoking a lot of Pantagruelian herb. So.
Rightly so. But yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting because I've seen that the term "do with that wilt," and it's one of the interesting things. I'm a big fan of Jordan Maxwell. Obviously, unfortunately, he's no longer around, died recently, but he had this term in the context of magic when he says the reason why they call it Hollywood is because that's what the magicians used to use for their wands. So it used to be the wood of holly, the holly tree. That's where he tied it into the nature of Hollywood and the entertainment industry is to essentially monopolize the consciousness of the viewer or the observer or the person engaged, and you know, and the entire entertainment industry is obviously constructed around that basis, and that's what's so interesting about the more and more you look into, the more and more I've been looking into like magic or alchemy, it seems to be explicit in society. This isn't a hidden thing. This is everywhere. This is like absolutely this is everywhere.
Yeah, I think it was William Burroughs who said that you can view the history of the human race as competing systems of magic, right? And that's more obvious when we start to think about religion. I mean, most religions, there's a difference between religion and magic, but most religions employ magic. They use ritual technology to cause change in the consciousness of their adherents.
One of the interesting things when I seen in your book was you had a little section that it was on the chapter on entities, and it's just interesting. Obviously, it drew my eye, understandably. But you've got, and when I was looking through it, you had a perfect quote that just conforms to the channel essentially. So it's that you're talking about brain neurons, mirror neurons. And if I was to just read the quote, as the brain and its mirror neurons can be fooled and in ways that we often enjoy. For instance, we look at cartoons, and because they have humanoid features and can communicate, we can emphasize with characters for at least the duration of the comic strip or show. You know, and considering the animations I do, it's quite interesting that you would use that context. You know, it's good.
Right. Yeah, the mirror neurons are they're very sensitive to facial expressions and to hand movements, and also to speech that sounds like it might be intelligible. Right. I mean, you can hear somebody speaking in a language you don't understand and still understand that it's language. Right. So our brains are kind of making that distinction all the time. Is something an entity attempting to communicate with me, or is it an inanimate object, right? So we're always doing that. When, let's say, the idea that a lot of people have is that like primitive man, when he encountered things in his environment, you know, storms or trees or whatever, he ascribed consciousness to it as a way to understand it better. Now, actually, we're sort of coming around the other side of that now, where physicists, there's an idea called panpsychism, where they're starting to come to the conclusion that consciousness is a fundamental principle, that you can't describe consciousness in terms of anything else, because it's one of those fundamental principles that makes up the universe, and that things are that everything around us has some measure of consciousness. Whether or not we can describe these things as sentient in terms of, like, talking to your neighbor or the way we're talking here, or not, is kind of, we don't really know. There's been a lot of interesting research in that field of panpsychism, for instance, with forests. I live in a forest here, and there's a lot of evidence that the trees are able to communicate to each other via the mycelium and mycorrhizae that connect them underground, and that trees cooperate with each other and display attributes that we would normally reserve to consciousness. It's only in recent years that we've understood that some animals actually have fairly complex languages, and ones that would surprise you. Crows have actually, they speak in several different dialects. They pass news along to each other. They actually have very complex languages. Right. So are things that if I go and I look at a stream and I get some sense that there's an entity there and my mind is attributing sentience to it, is it a nature spirit, or is it something that my mind is, a pattern that my mind is trying to fill in? Mm-hmm. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter, right? If you can get useful information from it or feel connected to it in some way, and so on, you can treat these things as entities. And again, maybe they are, right? Maybe they're conscious, maybe they're not. There's actually an interesting, one end of this panpsychism thing is looking at things like the sun. The recent space probes that have gotten near the sun show that it's super complex. There's an awful lot of crazy stuff going on the sun that we just don't understand. Complexity of these patterns of energy and force and stuff. And one theory is that, yeah, the sun it's conscious. It's an entity that's there and it's doing things. So primitive humans, I hate to use that term, our forebears, our ancient Paleolithic ancestors, all pretty much uniformly thought that the sun was an entity, was a god. Mm. And almost every early culture you had, solar deities, and going back to Sumerians and so on, Shamash and so on. Mm-hmm. And so is the sun conscious or not? I don't know. I don't know if humans will ever be able to communicate or grasp things on that level, right? Yeah.
Funny sorry, Phil, were you talking about the spirits of the plants, stuff like that? You reminded me of, and I forget the individual's name. He's a rapper, and he was talking about cannabis in that context. That there's, and he was saying the name of it. He was because he was on a podcast, and the individual, the interviewer was saying, so obviously, do you consume cannabis? And the guy, and he went, oh, and he said the name, and he put an emphasis on the respect you've got to have behind engaging with these plants. And he was connected to a tribe, clearly his family or something like that. I'll have to find the image and put the image of the guy up. But yeah, so it's the same thing, and that's one of the things that in your book you put a ritual process that you can engage with after consuming cannabis, a meditative process. I mean, what is it you think? What do you think's going on a neurological level when you consume cannabis? Is it because one of is it just the reduction in the default mode network opens up extrasensory perception and then take it from there, kind of thing? Is that what you're?
Well, I think I think we don't fully understand yet, but we're getting some hints. Just to start that, historically there's cannabis entities going back to prehistory. Again, in China there was Ma Gu, the hemp maiden. where the ritual to contact Magu is you go up on this mountain, throw hemp seeds down, and there's still a mountain in China where there's just all this wild hemp growing because people still go there and make offerings to Magu. There was, let's see, Kidder in the Sufi tradition, who was a form of the prophet Elijah or whatever, but was a cannabis entity. And when they would say, when a Sufi would say something like, we're having a visit from Kidder, it meant, I'm visiting Kidder. Right? Right. It was their slang for getting high. Let's visit Kidder. So there's plenty more. There's cannabis entities just through all of history. And I've outlined a really simple method in the book to do it. I don't think I could share the whole thing here right now, but it's pretty simple. Anybody can do it in like 10 minutes, and you get some sense of the entity. Now, what's happening neurologically, it's hard to say, but there is, with cannabis, there's definitely that different sort of interplay between, as you said, the default network and the executive function in the prefrontal cortex. You have more of both with cannabis. Typically, those are mutually exclusive. When you're concentrating on problem solving, your default network shuts down. When you're daydreaming, fantasizing, imagining, and using your default network, generally the executive function part, the problem solving stuff, shuts down, right? Which is why when you were a kid in school, your teachers always said, stop daydreaming and do your math, right? Because they were mutually exclusive. So cannabis gives you that very unique experience where you have some of both, where you have both that problem solving capability and the executive function, where and the default network, where you're able to imagine and kind of see the ramifications of every idea, right? Every idea comes with like every possible variation on it, right? Now, our brains have these parts in the, let's see, I'm not gonna name brain areas because I'll probably get it wrong, but there's areas in the brain that are dedicated to our ability to socialize, to recognize each other as entities. Now, like you're looking at me now, or you think you are, you're just seeing pixels on a screen, right? And you're hearing a digitized voice from a distance, yet hopefully you're able to ascribe sentience to me because of the way I'm acting, the way I'm saying things. Similarly, when we're experiencing entities through the use of entheogens or cannabis or whatever, we're using that part of the brain that recognizes things as entities. Is it right or is it wrong? I don't know, right? It's like the cartoon example, right? When somebody's watching CANNAMAN and they're at least for that moment empathizing with the character, which for a stoner is pretty easy to do because there's things that we relate to, right? Is CANNAMAN really an entity that you've created? That it could exist without you, right? I mean, those videos are there whether you're sleeping or you've left the planet or whatever. And maybe people will pick it up after you and continue the character, right? I often use the example of Sherlock Holmes as a great as an entity that came out of Arthur Conan Doyle's brain at one time, but how many different variations? Arthur Conan Doyle's been gone for 100 years or something, and yet there's still Sherlock Holmes lives on. Right? Is Sherlock Holmes an entity or something discarnate that materializes in movies and things like that, or is it just strictly existing on that level of information? It doesn't really matter, right? We still learn from Sherlock Holmes. And those stories have had a major influence on the world in terms of law enforcement and forensics and people's entertainment and happiness and things like that.
It's interesting that, because that's one of the, it's a bizarre notion that when you're describing it as Sherlock Holmes an entity, or is it just an idea in an individual's brain? Because even the process of Arthur Conan Doyle creating Sherlock Holmes, that's what makes this genuinely peculiar when it comes to CANNAMAN, the character, because very often it doesn't even feel like I made him. It feels bizarre. It feels very peculiar. And like when I see him, it's like, and I'll be honest, even when I'm coming up with the ideas, it doesn't really feel like I'm coming up with them. It kind of feels like I allow myself to be quiet enough to hear them.
And writing, particularly writing fiction, and writing a cartoon is certainly an example of that, is definitely a magical act. There was a fantasy writer in the early 20th century, James Branch Cabell, who was actually Alistair Crowley's favorite novelist, and probably experimented with cannabis and various things. But Cabell, he proposed the idea of the novelist as sorcerer, and he would say, you know, the way to write a novel is you put on your magical robes and you make your invocation, and then you sit down to write. So there's a lot of parallels between the magical process and writing fiction and creating fictional characters. I'm also a novelist, along with my books on magic. And the last novel I wrote some years ago, Legendary Blue Smoke, it was my experiment in writing a novel from a first-person perspective, and I created this character Ian, who was a former rock star and stuff like that. And after a while, Ian told the story. I just got out of the way. And it was just, you know, what would Ian say here? And I would just access it that way. And a lot of novelists and fiction writers have similar experiences. It's kind of a common thing. So there's actually some interesting research into the way that we understand personalities and consciousnesses, and your brain can actually generate multiple consciousnesses within itself. For instance, have you ever had a dream where there was one of your friends was in it and they behaved like your friend? Right? Your brain is creating essentially within itself a model of the character, and it's pretty much behaving as much as you know about the character the way that they would. And the extreme end of that is dissociative disorder or multiple personality disorder, where people actually have different personalities who are unaware of each other. Right, the Sybil, or right, the famous stories like that. What was it, the 9 Faces of Eve, or whatever, right? But that's a real disorder, and people do experience that. Just recently, they've taken some of those people and put them in the brain scanning equipment, and they've actually been able to see that there are these different personalities in the brain that occupy different areas of the brain, and they can run simultaneously. So, and that actually brings us to a big chunk of magic, which is the Keys of Solomon, sometimes called the Goetia, where there's these 72 spirits or demons that the magician can contact and ask for things. And the demons are notoriously tricky, and you have to really kind of navigate their deceptions and things like that. Alistair Crowley in, what year was it, 1914 or something like that, he said, the spirits of the Goetia are parts of the human brain. Now, at the time, that was a hugely controversial thing among magicians, many of whom still today believe that these spirits are something external to us. That they're these, you know, they're floating around out in the world. I used to, when I would originally teach this stuff, I would kind of correct Crowley and say, well, he meant the mind, right? The mind, not the brain, right? But actually, since we've been seeing this in brain scans now, it just could well be that these are in fact parts of the brain that people are accessing, since people have very similar experiences of these entities in different contexts and so on. Are there also,
Sorry, do you think that's kind of like what Carl Jung says about the archetypes then? So humans have these symbolic representations in their psyche, and they're just accessing it. And if that's the case, when you're invoking them, because I've got a book here, Manly P. Hall's Secrets of the Ages, and he mentions 2 or 3 things in it about specific daemons or demons and things you can interact with to provide certain results in the physical realm. And if that's the case, how can they provide results if they're just representations of your psyche or symbols that reside in your psyche?
Well, Jung proposed the idea of the collective unconscious, where there's some level where we're all sharing in all of this. Mm-hmm. And again, there's an interesting thing is that we tend to think of our consciousnesses as being these very individual. Here, this is me right here, inside this right here, right? But it's not that simple. It's actually kind of a trick that our brains are doing for us that allow us to navigate the world. On the most prosaic level, you're breathing in and out, right? Is the air in front of you right now part of you, or is it only part of you when you inhale it? Right? Is the cannabis here? Is this part of me? Or is it part of me when I do this? Right? So we're always interfacing. Food is another example. We're always interfacing with the world around us. Our skin is a permeable membrane. There's gases going in and out of your skin, and your skin is interacting with the environment. But we don't realize that. It's not something that our consciousness is very much aware of. On the broader thing, there's actually some interesting science about how we actually store memories and do some of our thinking with the world around us, right? Mm-hmm. We are actually integral parts of this whole system of an ecosystem, a consciousness system between humans. The neuroscientists are all, particularly after understanding some things about the mirror neuron system, we are all connected. Humans are a kind of hive mind, right? So we are connected on ways, even just on the most prosaic unconscious levels, where our brains can read unconscious cues and things in the environment that our conscious minds kind of slide by just to make things easier, right? So on some level, we are all connected, which may provide some justification for Carl Jung's collective unconscious, that we do interact with each other and with the world on levels that we're not always fully aware of. This is an area that's only, I mean, people have had these beliefs and explored this stuff since the dawn of human consciousness, but science is only just now getting around to this. So we have some interesting years ahead of us, seeing what people find out.
Definitely. I think that's where it comes to generally magic being criticized from scientific people that are looking for empirical results, because obviously, as you know, the basis of the scientific method is repeatability, and in order to gain credibility in the scientific world, you've got to be able to repeat right across the globe over and over different, and you get the same results. So I think that's where obviously like magic would be criticized immediately under that context for the repeatability thing. I mean, what would you say to somebody that was criticizing that dynamic?
Well, actually, when I was in college, that was so many years ago, and I was taking psychology courses, I wrote my first paper on exactly that subject, right? On how do you study the occult, right? How do you study magic in terms of psychology? We're starting to see some studies that are just sort of getting to it now, understanding how important ritual is to human consciousness, and so on. And then there's people like Rupert Sheldrake, for instance, or Stanley Krippner, who have done studies that are actually showing how there are so-called paranormal results from certain actions that we take, or from certain experiences that we have. Crowley's idea was a more sort of personal science, that you would learn things about yourself, that you didn't have to, you could take a ritual, let's say, the first ritual that many magicians learn is called the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram. And probably hundreds of thousands of magicians worldwide practice this all the time. Crowley's idea was that you would take the ritual, and before making a judgment on what does this do, or does this work, or is magic real, or whatever, you would perform the experiment. You would do this for yourself. And then you could turn in your own consciousness, in your own magical space, your magical laboratory, you would determine the results and keep accurate records, and try to include as many variables as you could, including the time of day, the weather, the what you ate previously, and things like that. And so that kind of stuff, ultimately, if you could accumulate records from, like, thousands and thousands of people, you could probably correlate them and learn some things that way, which some magicians have done, and some magical orders. But the main thing is that it's things that you learn about yourself, right? How does this ritual work for me? And the process is essentially scientific. You set a hypothesis. Well, it's a banishing ritual, so it's going to help me clear my mind, or clear my space, or whatever. And so then you would perform the ritual, and you would do this repeatedly. You wouldn't just do it once and go like, oh fuck, you would repeat it, and if things were not happening the way you wanted, maybe you tweak one variable and move on and keep records, and then finally you can say, well, yeah, this helped me clear my mind a little bit, right? So maybe there's another ritual, whatever. So it's a sort of personal form of science. It doesn't have to be peer reviewed or published in an academic journal. It's just what you learn for yourself.
So you sound as one of the interesting things as well, and it actually takes us onto the Neurolinguistic Programming, is that like things like the law of attraction. A lot of people will be familiar with the basis of the law of attraction, and interestingly, that's what I mean about the wee synchronicities of stumbling across a lot of this periphery information relating to magic and alchemy that wasn't explicitly saying that that's what it was connected to, because the law of attraction, I mean, let's say, Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, but is very much like Kabbalistic, and it's the way it describes itself. Like I've got one of the books, it's the three initiates. It's the Hermes Trismegistus, and in that it describes it like the seven points about the universe that it promotes in that. Essentially is describing on a few factors the law of attraction of you use your consciousness and your intention, you visualize, you provide regular daily repetition and correlation with that thought process, and as a consequence of that you'll bring in what your intention was desiring, and that's it's just kind of, I think, I don't know, like, how do you resolve that? And the like, is it because everything's all connected, and then you're like manipulating the energy force to then, I mean,
well, everybody's got their own little theory on how these things work.
I mean, you've been practicing magic and you've been studying these things for years and years and years. Surely you have conclusions.
I have. Okay, I'm what's called a model agnostic. Okay,
Right.
I believe that you can step into models or sets of beliefs and have particular experiences. Whether those models are true or not is another thing. That's something for the scientists to play around with. But by stepping into different models, different things happen. If you were to step into the model of, I don't know, a fundamentalist religious person, and adopt those beliefs for a little while, it's also called paradigm piracy. But you can step into those beliefs for a little while, and you may have positive experiences or negative experiences that seem to confirm that model. However, if you step into the model of a magician or something like that, you may have totally different experiences that would contradict the things that happened in the other model. So are they true or not? doesn't really matter.
I was going to say, what's interesting, it sounds to me, it's like, so the potential perspectives that you can gain about the world are either all true or all of them are not.
Right, there you go. I'd say there's some truth in everything and some falsity, right? Models are models because they're not the whole thing, right? They're never perfect. So our different models of how things work, or consciousness, or whatever, and even in science, that's sort of baked in as the idea of the theory, is that when new information comes along, you update your theory.
Yeah.
Right. You're not locked into that one model or theory. If something else happens that contradicts it, then you have to rethink it or perform another experiment or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, science also has like foundational laws which it builds its behavior on. So I mean, what are the foundational laws that magical practice is engaged with?
It depends. Again, it depends what system you're involved in. If you're in that Hermetic tradition where all things are mental, right? That's a good operating belief that allows you to understand the way that you're influencing things. Well, because it's all part of your mind. It's all mental, part of your consciousness. I mean, there's other systems, like some of the African derived traditions where the Loas and the Orishas and so on are definitely external entities to us, and they're out there in the world, and you can communicate with them and have things happen. And if you step into those beliefs, those things definitely happen. And part of my thing over the years is that I go to, I don't know, as a magic author, I get invited to a lot of different events, and I go to the ritual. I go to everybody's rituals, every different system, whether I'm a practitioner or not.
Right. And
I have seen the craziest things in just about every different system, whether or not it's something I believe in or not. And so I have respect for anybody who's able to work within one system or another and actually get results, right? I mean, I think that's awesome. But when people start, there's a danger there when people start to, they get results from it, and they go, well, this is the one true way.
Yeah.
Right. That's when it gets dangerous, that people start getting locked into one thing, and then they want to fight it out with everybody else over, no, my way works, right? So
I think that's what, like, I find such a fascinating thing. I'm like, I'm on a real existential pursuit these past few years, and I think that that's what's drawn me to things like alchemy and magic and stuff. And I think when you look at the world, individuals at the higher echelons of like the entertainment industry, or even just generally society, they seem to put a lot of focus, and inevitably they would be applying techniques that it just seems to be, there's a lot of focus on perception, and perception seems to be a huge factor for individuals that would be potentially engaging in things like magic for malevolent purposes in the entertainment industry and things like this. And that's obviously, I mean, what are your comments on that kind of thing? Because it does seem like anybody watching this, that the internet is rife for that kind of stuff, that people are using magic for, malevolent intention, whereas things like I kind of like Lord of the Rings. So Lord of the Rings kind of provides that template. You know, you've got Frodo, that's the everyman. There's a magical undertone. You've got Gollum, that's the evil side. You've got Samwise Gamgee, which is the positive side of the psyche. You've got Gandalf, that's in between the negative side of magic and the righteous side of magic. There seems to just be this, that template, that theme of this. Obviously, that's magical based. So I mean, that's that thing. What were your comments on things like the entertainment industry, and because you mentioned earlier, like I think the pentagram, that's throughout numerous, like, you could, a compilation of music videos that have got the pentagram would be nauseous. You'd be nauseated by the end of it. So I mean, what's your comments on that kind of thing?
Well, I think there's a lot of people in entertainment who are very conscious about doing magic. The most famous would be, say, for instance, David Bowie, who was a magic practitioner. It's in his lyrics. There's Kabbalistic stuff in his lyrics. There's very deliberate references to Crowley and the Golden Dawn and things like that. And he was a very serious practitioner of it because he wanted to improve his performances. And that's what he used the magic for. And also to create these characters, right? He had Ziggy Stardust and the Thin White Duke, and who he would kind of invoke them and come out on stage as Ziggy Stardust, not necessarily as David Bowie. And if you see videos of him in different periods, it's almost like you're looking at a different person. And he used it very deliberately. He also used other things like cut up techniques and things like that, which are deliberate magical things that are used to change consciousness and so on. And there's a couple of books that have been written about this subject, Bowie in particular. Let's see, other ones, I mean, Led Zeppelin. But all my music references are gonna, I'm old. They come out of right, the 70s and the 80s, or whatever. But like Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page actually owned Crowley's house, Moleskine, for many years and was a practitioner of magic and so on. And any number of bands we can name have used some aspect of magic or mysticism or so on to more fully explore their music and to make it more popular in terms of what they're doing. One, let's see, it really blew me away was, I'm trying to remember what year, late 70s, maybe early 80s, no, late 70s, Peter Gabriel, the Security tour, where they would come out and just do this big ritual, where they would come out from the back of the audience playing drums and marching up to the front and do this whole circling thing and this ritual. It was immensely powerful, and the audiences would get super caught up in it, and it was like being at a religious revival or something. It's really intense. So, and of course, there's just a lot of parallels between like concerts and raves and festivals and things. Some of the people at the beginning of the whole rave phenomena and acid house music and things like that, people like Genesis P-Orridge and so on, were very deliberately attempting to create magical experiences. They were doing ritual on stage and with the music. So a lot of it's there consciously. That's the positive side. These are people who were trying to create positive experiences and make their music better and things like that. On the negative side, we see people engaging, well, let's see, in the USA in particular, when we had the crazy orange guy as our president, when he was running, there were people who were doing mimetic magic, internet memes and things like that, using the Egyptian god Kek, the frog god, and things like that, that were deliberately designed magical sigils and things like that, that were intended to influence the election in Trump's favor and so on. You probably saw maybe a little bit of that in terms of like Brexit and things like that over in the UK. But people definitely doing magic to influence events and things like that. In terms of like popular music and things like that, I'm sure there's people who are doing the nasty kind of magic. I'm not so tuned into that. I don't know. Even death metal, I don't know how malicious they really are. They're sort of having fun with it, right? But there's probably, I don't know. For my money, when I've seen the malicious people try to do it, it's not as good. It's like in the United States, liberals have a lot of comedy shows, late night comedy shows. When the conservatives try to do it, it's never funny. They somehow don't get the idea of a joke. So.
I watched some of your interview on I can't remember the podcast name, but you'd mentioned that you've spoken to Terence McKenna a few times when he was around.
Oh, okay.
What was that like? I mean, what was the reason I ask it was I watched the other interview the other day, and I think last week or the week before, and it just popped up, and I was just surprised because Terence McKenna talks about magic on numerous lectures, and that's where a lot of my information I have about magic is from Terence McKenna, where he describes it as a tool that can be used based on the intention. You have a spectrum of influence. There's the white side and then the black side. And it's all based on intention, defined based on which end of the spectrum. So what was your conversations with Terence like, and how did that even come around?
Well, I was back in the day, I was the interviewer.
Yeah.
I used to do what you were doing, only we didn't have podcasts, so it was for print magazines. And so I had a lot of connections to people who knew Terence and so on. I was friends with Robert Anton Wilson, and had met a lot of people who shared mutual friends and so on. So I was working for a magazine called Future Sex, and they wanted me to interview Terence about what would you do with mushrooms to have a sexual experience or whatever. And Terence and I got off on a much more interesting conversation on the history of mushrooms and early humans and the stoned ape theory and all this crazy stuff. And it was just too much for the people at Future Sex. They were like, there was about 2 paragraphs about sex in there. They were like, oh, okay. So they didn't run most of that, and I ended up publishing it elsewhere. But anyway, Terence and I got talking, and we stayed in touch after that. And towards the end of his life, he had invited me to come out and be part of. He was doing a festival out in Hawaii called the Alchemy. I think it was called the Alchemy Arts Festival. And but then he learned that was the point where he learned that he had cancer, and he canceled everything. And so I never got to go out there. But anyway, we had some crazy conversations, about magic and mostly about mushrooms, which was his main thing that he always wanted to talk about. It's funny. I was just surprised because fun.
A lot of when I was watching the interview, let's say, it came up, and I was just surprised because obviously it's, I've listened to a lot of his stuff. So when he was talking about magic, it was just perfect opportunity considering the theme of this conversation. But you've also got one of the other books you do is the Neurolinguistic Programming, relating to magic. Right. Could you just briefly touch on that and exactly what it is and the context in which magic arrives?
Well, okay. Neurolinguistic programming is it's about using language and behavior to, in effect, program your mind. Right? Metaphors here. But it evolved out of things like general semantics and the linguistic study of grammar and things like that. It's about how we communicate. A lot of people use it for influence and stuff like that. When I do trainings, most of the people who show up are like therapists and practitioners of various kinds who want to be able to be more effective with their clients and so on. It's very similar. One of the stories that one of the founders, Richard Bandler, tells about it is that at the time he was living in California and practicing as a hypnotist, and California made it so that only doctors could do hypnosis, right? So what he did was created a system that did all the same things as hypnosis without the formal hypnosis, right? So in effect, that's sort of the origins of NLP. It has a rep where people think that it's this evil mind control thing that corporations and the Illuminati are using to control our brains and things like that, but no one's that organized.
I'll be honest. When I again, like researching I'll be honest, researching you for this conversation. When I came across neurolinguistic programming, it just reminded me of the numerous motivational speakers that they do. That you engage, like just language that's getting used, and it just seems to be like again intention orientated. It's not malevolent neurolinguistic programming. It's all based on the intention.
Right. Well, of course, I'd say the most famous self-help guy who came out of NLP was Tony Robbins. Who studied NLP and used to actually teach pretty good NLP with his first books and stuff before he became more interested in selling Tony Robbins. And probably I would think that anybody who is going to get into public speaking and things like that, there's quite a few who have explored NLP as a good resource to learn how to do that more effectively and so on. So I got into it as a writer because I wanted to learn how to write more effectively, and I think it helped me in that regard.
I mean, could you describe, it's obviously you could say no, but what's the most profound thing that you've seen in the world of magic? Like obviously that's most people, and that's what they're you know, I think that's what comes to me when I think about magic. I'm very existential, metaphysically orientated with the way I think. And I think that's what I'm trying to look for through this existential pursuit that I'm on, is that there's like evidence of something other than the physical realm.
Right.
And it's not just based in the human interpretation or the subjective fallacy that's the individual.
Well, I think some of the more profound things that I could describe are probably very subjective to me. They're experiences I had when I was suddenly aware of the oneness of everything, and the sense of things on a cosmic level, and the interconnections between things, and really feeling it and experiencing it and so on. That would be the most profound thing. Some of the weirder things have been, like synchronicities, where when I was practicing magic and doing things like lucid dreaming experiences and things like that. Let's see, one night I had a dream that I got off the bus on the way to work and found an envelope with money in it. The next day, I got off the bus on the way to work, and there was an envelope on the ground. I picked it up, and it was full of money. Right. So I mean, that's sort of a weird synchronicity. To me, it was nice to have some money, but not as profound as, say, having a mystical experience or a vision like that. Let's see, some other weird things. Entity experiences. Sometimes you have entity experiences where, it's sort of it's an imagination experiment where you're like creating a character, like creating CANNAMAN, right? Where you have this entity and you can actually learn things from it, or just let it behave the way it does. And then sometimes there's entity experiences where, God damn, there's a fucking entity in front of me, and it looks just as real as a human, and it does something crazy. Let's see, a couple of years ago, I was at every summer I go teach workshops at the Starwood Festival, which is now out in rural Ohio, and a couple of years ago I was there, and I did a workshop with folks where I took them into this hypnotic trance experience where they were just being perceptive to what was around them, and sensing the entities that were around them and so on. I finished the workshop. I went back to my room and I lay down on the bed, and all of a sudden, boom, there was this thing in front of me that looked like Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, only kind of taller and like stretched, like you took Gandalf and sort of stretched him. And it looked at me, and it was sort of like buzzing and electric, but it was as real as like I'm seeing, realer than I'm seeing you because you're on the screen. And I said, "Who the fuck are you?" And it went and disappeared. And that was pretty crazy in terms of like, was I hallucinating or, but it was after I had done this whole trance experience with people who, to sense the entities around you and so on. So
I mean, I like that stuff. I've got real interest in things like paranormal and these things, because I'm the same. I do, let's say, I feel personally that and a lot of people think this as well, and I've got a real objective mind as well, as much as any human can be, let's be honest. But when I've got instances throughout my life where there are these bizarre synchronicities that don't really explain, and when I think about each synchronicity, there's one of them in particular where essentially that there's each synchronistic event has been crucial in the direction that I've been put down. It's bizarre. It sounds so silly. And even if I was to be honest, like even this thing here, that I don't know if you can see that, but it's that's the full tarot card. And I drew that I got sent over this thing from a friend about 4 or 5 years ago, before I really did any of this. This was like, I personally to be honest, like I feel like I've manifested this through a process of repetition, action, and intention. And the fool that I drew of the tarot card was sent over to me at somebody at college about 6 years ago before I started doing the channel, and it was to apply for this competition. I didn't look into what the fool thing was. Obviously just drew it, sent it in, and didn't win it or any of that. But fast forward, and then here it is behind me, and that obviously I'm sure you're aware, but the basis of the Fool tarot card is the individual that goes on the journey. It's the fool before the jester. You have to take that leap of faith. You have to kind of pursue that endeavor of the craft, and then you step off. That's what you're stepping off into the unknown. You've got to maintain enlightenment to transfer yourself into the next being after the fool, which is. Was it the jester, or is it the fool is the savior? It's the precursor to the savior.
Right. Then the magician. Right?
The magician. Is that right? Well, that's interesting then, Phil, because I only realized that that's what that meant 2 years ago. Like less than 2 years ago, actually, if I'm being honest. When I started doing the channel, it was about 3 years ago, 3 years ago, and I found after studying into this kind of esoteric thought stuff, and I was like, that's so bizarre that the path that I'm exactly on of taking a chance, of engaging in the craft and taking faith and being a bit of a fool, because essentially I'm choosing that famine over tyranny at the moment. Essentially I'm just kind of producing something in the hope that it's going to really truly manifest into something.
The tarot is absolutely fascinating, and many magicians use the tarot. Again, it's a good illustration of Jung's archetypes.
Yeah.
Right. Of each one of the major arcana cards, the trump cards are one of these major archetypes. Right. The fool, the magician, the priestess, the emperor, and so on. And the fool it's card 0, because the fool is the consciousness that goes through the rest of this, that has the experience going through the journey and ending up at the last of the trump cards, which is the universe. And it describes the journey of magical attainment of knowledge and so on. Traditionally there was an entity set over the tarot that you would invoke and say, guide my cards for me, right? And then you lay out the cards, in the belief or the idea that entity was helping to create these synchronicities. And again, there's a number of actually there's a chapter in the book on divination, because it's so tied up in all of this, right? I mean, there's so many different systems of the tarot, the I Ching, the Ifa oracle, geomancy, scrying, all these different things. And there's a good cannabis connection through all of that. In Crowley's book on the tarot, he actually begins, the Book of Thought, he actually begins with this long excerpt of an essay on using cannabis to do it, the sacred herb. He doesn't call it cannabis. He doesn't identify it, but the sacred grass of the Arabs.
Right.
Right. And and he talks about how the qualities of mind that it induces are so useful in interpreting the divinations and all this stuff. Yeah. Also, one of a previous magician who was actually a big influence on Crowley was P.B. Randolph, who was an American. When was he? He was a friend of Abraham Lincoln, so it would have been late 1800s, and he was also the biggest importer of hashish to the United States at the time.
Nice.
And he wrote books on divination, on clairvoyance, and basically his method was smoke your hashish or eat your hashish, and then the divination follows. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Then you're clairvoyant. Yeah. Right. And he had charts. Some of this is in High Magick. He had charts of like when you'd close your eyes and you'd see different colors, or when you'd look at someone and you'd see different colors after getting high. The different colors could be interpreted in different ways, and so on. So just a form of divination in itself. So
Well, let's see, Phil. This has been an absolute pleasure. Sorry for holding you so long here.
No, it's fine.
But let's say this has been an absolute pleasure, and thanks so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks to Phil for giving me his time, and thanks to you for sticking around until the end of the video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the content. I'll see you next time.